So we're welcoming our next guest who joins us from Hong Kong. So we might want to put her up on screen, which would be nice. Thank you very much. Hello Noit Banai, joining us from Hong Kong. She's back in the future. I'll just shortly introduce you, Noit, and then hand over the microphone virtually to you. Noit Banai holds a PhD from Columbia University and is an art historian and a critic who specializes in modern and contemporary art on a global scale or in a global context, with a particular focus on conditions of migrations, exile, diaspora, border regimes, and statelessness. She's currently Associate Professor for Art and Theory, at the Academy of Visual Arts in Hong Kong Baptiste University. Previously, she served as a professor of contemporary art in the Department of Art History at the University of Vienna and lecturer of modern and contemporary art at Tufts University School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She is the author of Eve Klein, which was published in 2014, and just recently published a book, Being a Border, in which she writes on the techniques of the border in contemporary art and culture. An always very highly relevant topic, unfortunately even more so in the past weeks. Noit has also written on Gego in this book, and as well with her today's lecture, Gego Speaking Exile, she approaches Gego's constitution of an aesthetic and linguistic practice in relation to her status as a German Jewish woman and her subsequent condition of statelessness and exile. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Greetings from Hong Kong. Thank you so much to Stefanie Reisiger, who made this happen, to Ulrike Gross, of course, to Philipp Kurz, and to the hardworking staff, Anne Volk and Tobias Renner. Thank you very much. And finally, I would like to thank Monica Amor, who shared her work with me over the years, but also thank Gabriela Rangel, who sowed the seeds of Gego and the question of Gego's Jewish background many, many years ago. So without further ado, I will begin my lecture. So Gertrud Goldschmidt was notoriously tight-lipped about her practice, preferring to leave the task of analysis to others, and even more reticent about her biography, which she considered inconsequential to understanding her artwork. Around the time of the eponymous entitled exhibition Gego in 1977, she offered some clarifications for this rationale. She wrote, quote, "Each life is governed by origins and beginnings, by encounters and adjustments, leading to the present. Self-objectivity is impossible. When I start to analyze my path, I get lost in anecdotes that may be significant in terms of my own memory, but which are totally meaningless and redundant to appreciating my work. The past of all human beings is rooted inside every one of us, and if I have ended up with a certain combination of possibilities, what I do, it has been as the result of a mildly dimensional chess game," unquote. This explanation, which recognizes the dangers of conflating an artist's life with their art, searching for punctual origins, or tracing vaulted lines of causality, ends with an opening towards the quintessential structuralist paradigm, namely the chess game. In its model, certain moves or enunciations on the artistic board are possible because of the unforeseeable ways in which the diachronic and synchronic forces of history intersect at any given moment. As Hubert Lamiche clarifies, quote, "Either you can think of it in terms of the whole history of a particular game, as it has developed up to that point, the succession of all the preceding moves, Or you stumble into the middle of the game and see the positions of the board at that moment and have to figure out what to do from then on, unquote. Over the last 2 decades, in keeping with such theoretical framing, Gego's practice has been the subject of renewed focus, with scholars examining her work as so many shifts on a complex ground of intersecting diachronic and synchronic vectors. As you all know, Gertrud Goldschmidt was born in Hamburg and emigrated to Caracas in Yes, okay. And would, by the end of her life in 1994, become celebrated as both a Latin American artist and a Venezuelan artist. Okay, my clicker has just lost the connection. 1 second. There we go. So I start from this passage and from this set of identities as set up by all kinds of administrative and governmental passages through these identity cards. And I would like to now take us back to 1937. At least I think it's 1937. And perhaps the family can clarify this for me. If it is the year 1937, because what is interesting in this particular ID card is that you have the name Sarah, Gertrud Louise Sarah Goldschmidt, on this identity card. And I guess I would like to ask the family if Sarah was her Jewish name, or if this was actually imposed by the Nazi regime, as all Jewish people had to take on the names of either Sarah or Israel, depending on whether they were male or female. If that is the case, this is from 1938, when that law was enacted. So I don't know if Sarah was a chosen name, a Jewish name that she took herself, or if it was imposed on her from the outside. Nevertheless, we see Gertrud Louise Sarah Goldschmidt in this photograph. So the passage from Sarah Louise Sarah Goldschmidt included exile from her home, language, and formative culture, separation from her entire family, and 18 years as a stateless subject, as she was stripped of her national rights in Germany with the passing of the Nuremberg race laws in 1935, and did not become a Venezuelan citizen until 1952. Like many of her generation, these political and geographic displays enabled Gego to survive the catastrophe of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and were minimized in her already abbreviated self-narration and virtually all subsequent analyses. The most dominant considerations of her artistic inventions and public interventions focus on understanding the artistic, conceptual, and symbolic constitution of the project of modernism and modernity in Venezuela, and on the broader exchanges between Europe and Latin America and vice versa. Much has been accomplished to enrich our understanding of Gego's multidimensional practice, including this very important research undertaken by the University of Stuttgart and by the Kunstmuseum Stuttgart. In keeping with this consideration, my aim is to develop, clicker is once again resting. Yeah. My aim is to develop an epistemology formed from the specific historical conditions, structures, and processes of subjectivization in which Gego came of age. Specifically, I would like to foreground the historical construct of Jewish difference, which organized the social order in the pre-World War II German context, and which was an evolving and mutually implicated hybrid of universality, Deutschtum, and particularity, Judentum, that was always already situated within a dynamic field of power differentials, including gender and class lines. Paradoxically, in order to be assimilated into either a universalist modernist idiom or regional national categorization, Gego's Jewish difference had to be erased, denied, or repressed. Thus, despite Gego's reticence to linger on her biographical narrative or to give it any weight in inflecting the interpretation of her artwork, I would like to proceed from a counter-assumption and read Gego against the grain.
And then we'll do it for you. Did you just hear me? If the clicker doesn't work for you, we'll do it for you. If that's easier.
Thank you, that would be helpful.
Just tell us when you want to go on and we'll do it from here, so you don't have to stress about it.
Thank you, because it's going into sleep mode. So here we are. Despite, this presentation today thus poses the following questions. 1, how can we understand the constitution of Gego's aesthetic practice in relation to her status as a German Jewish woman who survived the Third Reich state of exception, and also in relation to her conditions of statelessness and exile? 2, how can we attend to these historical and biographical aspects in ways that neither posit her artistic output as an illustration of a pre-established or essential identity, nor attempt to psychoanalyze the artist, nor diagnose her traumas and pathologies? 3, what do we gain by positing that Gego's path was mutually entangled with a paradigm of Jewish difference during one of the foremost states of exceptions of the 20th century? Perhaps I'll start with the third question. Much has already been written about the dispersion of Germany's Jews, including a significant strand of research that examines the contributions made by cultural practitioners who had taught or had been educated in Germany to their adopted countries. This is often the story of the migration of avant-garde and modernist forms, principles, and pedagogies, which spread beyond the German epicenter to various purported peripheries. While it is their Jewish difference that made it impossible for those individuals to remain in Germany, this element is too often presented as a biographical backdrop to their artistic accomplishment rather than a structural condition, one that the philosopher Hannah Arendt called the Jewish condition. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry if I'm screaming. It's hard to know the volume. So in different writings, she identifies 2 constitutive dynamics at the crux of this predicament, namely the prevalence of anti-Semitism in various European countries and worldlessness, a separation from state and society internal to Jewish history. Constructed as pariahs by external forces of anti-Semitism, Jews, quote, have no country, human rights do not exist for them, and society would gladly exclude them from its privileges, unquote. At the same time, because of their chosen worldlessness, itself a complex process that oscillates between a disregard of the historical world in favor of a community closed completely on itself, or an assimilationist tendency within the non-Jewish world that prevents them from seeing their own historical situation, Arendt argues that they did not have a place in the political universe of the modern nation state. Next slide, please. For Arendt, this double exclusion is ultimately a concrete political problem that, quote, made it possible to remove Jews totally from the life of the German nation, unquote. Yet in the decades before 1933, many Jewish artists, intellectuals, and writers cultivated a type of existence that transcended national borders. Indeed, they built upon what Arendt calls their social homelessness, to become, quote, the representatives of a nebulous international society where national prejudice appeared to be no longer valid, unquote. Next slide, please. With Stefan Zweig, who was born in Vienna and committed suicide in Brazil, in Petropolis. With Stefan Zweig as one of Arendt's primary examples, these were world citizens or internationally acclaimed cosmopolitans, precisely by virtue of a Jewish difference that impeded social acceptance in their own nation state. For Arendt, the mirage of a borderless life could not be sustained once the Third Reich's political and juridical exclusion of Jews literally rendered them homeless, propertyless, and stateless. Apart from Arendt's seminal writings, the complex identities of German Jewry and European Jewry more broadly have been the subject of interest of scholars for whom the notion of Jewish difference and double consciousness can productively intersect with other instances of racialization, construction of post-colonial subjectivities, and possibilities for post-national belonging. Next slide, please. Notably in this regard, W.E.B. Du Bois' travels to Poland on 3 occasions, 1893, 1936, and 1949, shaped his thinking on the problem of race and eventually on to the revision of his concept of the color line to extend beyond the historical experience of African Americans. Encountering the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto after the liquidation of the Jewish inhabitants, he was inspired to write The Negro in the Warsaw Ghetto in the magazine Jewish Life in 1952. Next slide, please. More recently, we have Paul Gilroy's formidable attempt to conceive of the uniquely modern diasporic identity created by Black Atlantic culture as it embraced and amplified multiple forms of consciousness against the absolutist claims of national and ethnic identity. Next slide, please. Gilroy credits the work of Jewish thinkers as a springboard for his meditation on, quote, the experience of Blacks inside and outside of modernity. In both historical communities, he writes, quote, what was initially felt to be a curse gets repossessed. It becomes affirmed and is constructed as the basis of a privileged standpoint from which certain useful and critical perceptions about the modern world becomes likely, unquote. That splintered modern identity has refracted exponentially under conditions of neoliberal global capitalism. Next slide, please. And today we encounter countless diasporic communities and populations of worldless individuals who have become the refugees, exiles, and stateless subjects of the 21st century. These are the worldless of the world. As both a theoretical prehistory of the present and a complement to the current Gego scholarship, I thus embark on a historical contextualization and analysis of her Jewish difference, which was on the one hand retrospectively articulated in her scant autobiographical writings, and on the other hand was the experiential foundation for the literary experimentations known as sabiduras and for many spatially oriented works. Next slide, please. By examining Gego's writings as a performative site for self-articulation, I explicitly emphasize the constitution of her subjectivity in relation to a broader constellation of historical discourses, institutional mechanisms, and effects of power, rather than privileging her personhood as a unitary entity existing in ontological isolation. I connect this linguistic field and her paradigmatic work, the Reticularia, and suggest that she transforms the structural conditions of Jewish difference and the doubleness, pariah status, and worldlessness that it entails into a hybrid form of belonging that appears more relevant than ever. If the Holocaust was a historical caesura, after which the Enlightenment believed that an individual had inalienable human rights or could be Jewish and German without contradiction, could not be sustained, Gego's practice lays the groundwork for the age of refugees, exiles, mass migrations, and displaced people. Her practice of world building, this is my argument, her practice of world building through lines, spaces, and words creates a ground for all particularities without ever reducing these subjectivities to an essentialist, racialized, identitarian form, all the while maintaining the possibility of multiple forms of belonging that at once resonate with and counter dominant structures. Over the period, next slide, please. I will get to the sabiduras soon. Over a period of 2 years between 1987 and 1989, Gego entered into a rather laconic correspondence with Professor Fritjof Trapp of the University of Hamburg. Under the aegis of the city's Senate, He was directing an investigation called Exile and Immigration of Hamburg Jews in order to trace the lives of Jews who had been forced to leave with the rise of Nazism. In this capacity, he sent her a comprehensive questionnaire that broached the details of her life in Hamburg and her subsequent emigration. While Gego drafted 3 different versions narrating her family's departure from Germany and her early life in Caracas, none of these were sent to Trapp. Her official responses to his questionnaire do not reveal very much, and she rebuffed his repeated advances by stating, quote, "Not all Germans were Nazis," unquote. The manuscript, along with other handwritten and typed writings, was discovered in 1999, 5 years after Gego's passing, in a handmade folder left in a trunk that she used to collect her file. I'm probably telling you things that you already know. The word sabiduras was written boldly on the file in capital letters. In 2005, the most complete version was included as testimony number 13. Esteemed Mrs. Goldschmidt, Honorable Professor Trapp, in the collection Sabiduras and Other Texts by Gego, which was edited by Maria Elena Huizi and Josefina Manrique. Gego's autobiographical sketch, which has now circulated in the public sphere for more than 15 years, is frequently incorporated into the chronology section of exhibition catalogs. It deserves close attention for providing us with significant factual information about her life. Yet it is also an exercise in a fictive self-construction and a work of memory produced when the artist was already in her 7th decade. It is useful, nevertheless, to hear Gego's account of her experience as a German Jew from Hamburg, as the text polysemy exceeds the writer's intentions and opens up what historian Tamar Garb has termed, quote, a representational theater, unquote, in which diverse realities and fictions take their cues from one another. Next slide, please. Gego narrates her early life in this way. My family was formed at the beginning of the 19th century by citizens and bourgeois of the free city of Hamburg. Our Jewish origin was accepted as fact, and we completely identified with German society, with German and Hamburger tradition and culture. I never visited a synagogue or a temple in the Jewish community, and it was much later that I learned the meaning of anti-Semitism. To emphasize the utter banality of her Jewish identity, whose ethnic origin went hand in hand with the contemporary culture of German bourgeois humanism, she adds the following words and underlines them in red ink. Perhaps one of the outstanding characteristics of my education was the respect for ideas, thoughts, and cultures other than my own. Another important aspect was the demand to take the community into account, not to bother anyone and not to be bothered. That is to say, to integrate oneself. I'd like to pause on this narrative for a moment, on this self-narration for a moment. This is not simply the language of a woman who accepts her gendered position within the norms of bourgeois respectability. In spite of her intentions, Gego articulates the individual and communal tensions of many middle-class Jewish families who experience the push and pull between German ethnicity and nationality as the basis for German Jewish identity. Gego's description of herself and her relation to the social fabric of the city is one that is only legible within the conditions of assimilated Jewry. This, one could say, is a state of difference, otherness, or particularity within a common culture that is presented as the universal culture, a state of difference that is at once vigorously denied and implicitly affirmed. Such a split or double consciousness clearly comes to the fore in Gego's writings. Though German Jews may have considered themselves an integral part of German society and were taught to respect the values of others, the demand to integrate themselves was nevertheless accompanied by a sense of tacit otherness, expressed economically as not to bother anyone and not be bothered. Indeed, it's vital to understand the cultural milieu in which Gego came of age, a time characterized by, quote, a dynamic of visibility and invisibility that formed a crucial social power for Jews living among populations that never completely accepted them, unquote. To do so, we need to take a close look at the diverse institutional and discursive structures that Gego negotiated and the social, educational, and political codes that articulated an ever more explicit racial line between Jewish and non-Jewish throughout the 1920s and 1930s. It's also critical to locate Gego's subjectivization within the intra-Jewish debates, mostly spearheaded by German Jews, surrounding the contrast between the Jews of Western and Eastern Europe. In this double investigation, we observe state mechanisms and techniques of biopolitical racialization within Germany, and at the same time, we witness internal processes of differentiation between Westjuden and Ostjuden within the trans-European Jewish community. I do not have time to unpack this fully, but I will give you quite a lengthy historical grounding nevertheless. Next slide, please. In 1910, 2 years before Gego's birth, and arousing much controversy, the German social and economic theorist Franz Oppenheimer articulated the difference between the Jews of Western and Eastern Europe in a book called Die Welt, or in a, excuse me, not a book, in a journal called Die Welt, Zentralorgan der Zionistischen Vereinigung. Quote, "We Western Jews have Jewish ethnic consciousness," he wrote, Stammesbewusstsein. But Eastern Jews have Jewish national consciousness, Volksbewusstsein. Ethnic consciousness rests on the past. It's something you find wherever an individual has the consciousness that he has descended from a nation. It is the consciousness of common descent or common blood, which means being able to trace oneself back to what was at least at one time a unitary nation. But national consciousness concerns the present. It means to share a common language and common customs, to have the same economic and legal position, to share a common intellectual culture. For Oppenheimer, the patriotism of Jews in the West, and specifically in Germany, could easily be defended. He writes, quote, the lands they fled to become their fatherlands or their fathers' fatherlands. These countries gave them language and customs, wealth and education. They gave them legal equality and awful full or almost full citizenship. It would be a bad person, he writes, an unnatural person who could forget such gifts, unquote. Oppenheimer's analysis and his reliance on this specific terminology are based on the particularity of modern German Jewishness, which was a mixture of Jewish ethnicity that was a vestige of the past and German nationality that was rooted in the present status of citizenship and identification with German culture. The articulation of a so-called German Jew, interwoven with their society and patriotic to their nation, emerged from a dual concept of Judentum and Deutschtum, Judaism and Germanness, which owe their basis to the German Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, and were the subject of intense debates and interpretations by various scholars throughout the 19th and 20th century. Next slide, please. If Enlightenment universalism became the basis for a certain archetype of bourgeois Germanness, Deutschtum, it also spawned a romantic historiography that emphasized the singularity of different nations and cultures and became the basis for a science of Judaism, Wissenschaft des Judentum. By the end of the 19th century, the Romanticist strain that espoused a unique Jewish nationality was minimized, and all that remained was a Jewish consciousness linked to Jewish ethical values that could be a synthetic part of a German nation. These intermeshed concepts of Germanness and Judaism, which served to advocate for Jewish belonging in the German fatherland, were often articulated in explicit and implicit contrast to the image of the tradition-bound, uncivilized, irrational Eastern Jew. Next slide, please. At the crux of Germanness was the ideal of Bildung, which Jews enthusiastically embraced as the basis for assimilation and which referred to, quote, an integrated conception of rationality and refinement. The person of Bildung was one informed by overall breeding and a cultivation of all the faculties. German Jews never lost sight of these Enlightenment ideals. Their belief in the primacy of culture, faith in reason, and the regenerative power of ideas and education remained a central, if illusory, element of their view of life, of their life. Bildung, which went hand in hand with belonging to the bourgeoisie, the Bürgertum, and its cultural connotations of citizenry, Bürger, thus incorporated the values of Enlightenment universality. Following the analysis of sociologist Max Weber, while class may have been based on, quote, naked pure economic power, unquote, social status was, quote, above all, in the imposition of a specific way of life, unquote. Thus, to belong to the Bürgertum meant, among other things, combining a middle-class income with the demands of the bourgeois lifestyle. In tandem with Jewish legal emancipation, Bildung was a way to nurture social blending, through which Jew and non-Jew could not be distinguished, as they both belonged to a bürgerlich class and could privately and publicly perform the codes of a bourgeois liberal humanism. Jewish emancipation in Germany was granted in 1848 by the Basic Rights of the Frankfurt Parliament, which stipulated that an individual's civil rights were not to be conditional on religious faith. Thus, Jews were eligible to become citizens, to vote, to be elected to the parliamentary assembly, and to participate in government. I should say that only in Hamburg, or particularly in Hamburg, among a few other places, the Frankfurt parliamentary decision was accepted. In many other places, in many other Länder, it took a much longer time to be ratified. So through this legal apparatus, Jews erroneously believed that they could have the conditions through which to assimilate and be no different from their Christian counterparts in the German fatherland. Despite, or as a result of the increasing anti-Semitism that accompanied emancipation, next slide please, the Zentralverein Deutsche Staatsbürger Jüdischen Glaubens, the CW, was founded in Berlin on March 26, 1893, and remained active until 1938. Its official aim was, quote, to unite all German citizens of the Jewish faith, regardless of their religious and political orientations, in order to help them maintain their civil and social equality, as well as to help cultivate their German-mindedness, the Deutsche Gesinnung. As we know, with the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the Third Reich definitively transformed Germany into a political unity based on blood, and according to Saskia Sassen, quote, cultural history was replaced by biology, and biology was used by the state as the standard for distinguishing between lasting connections and temporary coexistence. I'm now skipping through a whole part on Hamburg. Next slide, please. As we know, her Gego's diploma thesis, so I'm moving to Stuttgart, and I'm moving to the period when republicanism was turning to Nazism, and Gego enrolled in the architecture program at the Technischen Hochschule in Stuttgart. And we know, of course, that her diploma thesis was supervised by architect Paul Bonatz. And characteristically, it was described only in parenthetical remarks. Now, I'm just showing you this incredibly interesting page that I found on the website of the Universität Stuttgart, which shows some of the many people who were persecuted and disenfranchised during the Nazi era, including Paul Bonatz and Gertrud Goethe. And I think it's a really wonderful initiative, but very interesting that Jews and non-Jews are equally persecuted here without differentiation of the actual stakes. But a nice initiative nevertheless. So in parenthetical remarks, she writes it was that her diploma thesis was for a project I myself chose for an emigrants boarding school in Kent, England, as you all know. The next slide, please.
So this choice of topic is striking as it reveals that she was not oblivious to the changing status of German Jewry, and specifically the impossibility of maintaining the dual identity of German and Jew. New Bundscourt was shorthand for the New Herligen School, a progressive school founded by the Jewish teacher Anna Essinger in Herlingen, Germany in 1926, and reopened in Kent in the summer of 1933. As the situation on the continent deteriorated in the wake of Kristallnacht, the school accepted more and more Jewish refugee children who arrived in the Kindertransports from Germany, followed by annexed Austria, occupied Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary. It's interesting that during this intensifying state of exception, or relevant more than interesting, between 1937 and 1938, as her own Jewishness becomes biopolitical point of difference, even more intensified, that Gego's initial rationale for studying architecture, quote, influenced by social issues related to the social construction projects that developed at the time, unquote, is turned towards the most urgent issue facing her and results in an architectural thesis dedicated to New Bundscourt. So I'm now going to move very quickly to the next section. So please, if you could forward to the next slide. This is Anna Essinger. And to the next slide, please. Okay, so delivered via telegraph, Gego learned that she had received a visa for Caracas, a place that she did not know. She arrived in Venezuela via the Blue Star Line cargo ship in the summer of '39. And we know that she eventually learned Spanish on site from carpenters and workers at her lamp factory. According to Maria Elena Huizi and Josefina Manrique, Gego absorbed the speaking and writing patterns of those she employed, a language that, quote, bore no relation to grammatical purity or formal correctness. Its only concern, they write, was to convey meaning effectively, unquote. Another of Huizi and Manrique's claims is that Gego's, quote, constant search for transparency might explain her reduction of discourse to the bare minimum needed in order to crystallize an idea. Next slide, please. But what of sabidura? The miswritten Spanish word for wisdom, sabiduría, that is emblazoned on the handmade folder that held Gego's writings. Explanations about a desire for effective communication and transparency are not satisfactory, as this neologism and others invented by Gego achieves neither and thwarts both. Perhaps a different line of investigation might emerge from relating her linguistic and artistic articulations to her experience as a German Jew and her subsequent exile. Exile, unlike other movements of people, is linked to the state's role in compelling an individual to relocate by deprivation of citizenship, banishment, and persecution. It's thus an outcome of modernity and its constitution of belonging based on citizenship within the nation state. If this banishment is impelled by the state, the derivation of the word, most probably from the Latin ex salire, also communicates the active sense of leaping out towards something or somewhere. Thus, exile contains a sense of forced movement away from one place and an active or creative movement towards a new one. Next slide, please. In Reflections on Exile from 1984, Edward Said argues that the person exiled from their national homeland and estranged from their adopted country carries with them a psychic fissure that they try to restore to a perceived integrity. Echoing W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, Said suggests that the exile's difference is also the basis for their intellectual and literary ingenuity. Quote, seeing the entire world as a foreign land makes possible originality of vision. Most people are principally aware of one culture, one setting, one home. Exiles are aware of at least two. And this plurality of vision gives rise to an awareness of simultaneous dimensions, an awareness that, to borrow a phrase from music, is contrapuntal. Referring to a musical term in which two melodies are played or sang at the same time, Said postulates exile as a subjectivity that inhabits a plural imaginary across multiple temporalities and spaces. For Said, it is a condition of being simultaneously here and there, yet we could also envisage a state of being neither here nor there, or being permanently elsewhere. In these modes of being, the common denominator of exile is its configuration of an interstitial reality. Unlike Said's definition, in which it is the pain of leaving one's homeland that leads to a psychic fissure, Gego's early life was already predicated on a double consciousness, hinged between Deutschtum and Judentum. In her account, she insists that, quote, she did not want anything that tied her to her past, not even a memory, unquote. Not even a memory, something that proved impossible to sustain in the course of 50 years, unquote. Thus, at least performatively, she repudiated her homeland as a place she did not wish to remember. And yet, Gego's webbing and weaving of artistic languages and contexts not only emerges from the interstitial cultural, economic, and political topologies of her modern German Jewish formation, but imminently imagines a new cartography for a subjectivity that survived the state of exception, which was implemented to systematically eradicate it as a cipher of difference, meaning Jews. If you could go back one slide now. Thank you. Much like exile, Gego's neologisms exist as zones between the loss of the mother tongue and the lack of full integration into an adopted language. As such, they're not simply sites resonating with a painful deficiency, but are also sites of a restless resourcefulness and imagination. The short but meaningful distance between sabidura and sabiduria is both a no man's land of inarticulation and a space of eloquence. Just like the line, which Gego described as both, quote, human means to express the relation between points, unquote, and, quote, a medium that indicates materiality, the relation between points in space, unquote. Her neologisms are hinged between spatial coordinates of identity. Following Eva Hoffmann's description of James Joyce and Samuel Beckett's active choice to write in a foreign language as a way to cultivate another form of expression, we may liken the distance between sabidura and sabiduria to the creative transformation of linguistic exile. In this particular case, the association with wisdom and knowing adds an additional layer of signification, suggesting Gego's grasp of the power of spatial and linguistic mobility and her quest to enter into different subjectivities, as well as the subjectivity of another culture and another language. Next slide, please. Although Gego gave credit to art critic, poet, and curator Roberto Guevara for coining the word reticularia, she was also implicated in conceptualizing its parameters. Sabidura number 7, also titled Aire, which consists of 4 separate pages of notations, sheds light on her contribution. It was found in the files corresponding to the 1969 Reticularia exhibition, the first installation of the work in the Museo de Bellas Artes de Caracas. Written in Spanish, Gego's collection of words reads like careful lists of materials composed of nouns or proper names: aire, espacio, vacío, luz, cereales, trazo, triangulación interminable. Next slide, please. Here's the English. Other times, they are adjectives and verbs peppered with nouns, as with, if we can go to the next slide now, the ones you see in front of you, which you can read for yourself and performatively become a Gego molecule. There are occasions when she lapses into Latin, if we go to the next slide, like idem and ibid, ad finitum and constellum. Another moment when Spanish takes over, like habitable and despliegue. There are also instances of untranslatability, neologisms within the neologism. For example, reticuromo, polyreticle. Next slide, please. Thank you. In this heterogeneous mix, Gego imposes an equalization between the language of different authorities. For instance, the use of the sacred Latin in partnership with the vernacular Spanish brings together the language of the state with that of the population. Approached visually, these linguistic compilations might appear to be delineating spaces, whether by typographical arrangements that carve out blank open areas and enforce limits, upper or lowercase fonts that suggest mass and magnitude, the addition of grounding lines that emphasize emplacement or borders that erect fortresses. Words in this case fabricate a built environment, a materialization enforced by words such as ibid, short for ibidum, literally meaning the same place, and thus a stationary point, but also asking the reader to consult a reference that came before, thus connoting transit. Or idem, a term used in legal citations and academic references, which also asks the reader to examine an author's previous citation. Here too, we have different authorities, the academy and law, each one framed in their own mini-sphere of influence. Gego produces a spatial rhetoric entangled with divergent voices of authority, which become displaced and disempowered by the constant movement, from and to and from, mobility and passage, the same but different, a median state characterized by a restlessness that gives rise to new linguistic combinations and subject positions. Thus, the breakdown of uniform speech in favor of this polyphonic texture and in relation between these diverse languages and the linguistic fabrication of a spatial territory, what we have, I suggest that we have surpassed a static relation between a particular language and a particular territory. Interestingly, while there are many suggestions of multiplicity, with words connoting repetition, seriality, cross-referencing, we notice that the artist's own discursive inscription adopts the singular Latin If we can go back go back a few. One more. Right here. Oh, yeah, okay, here is good too. As in moleculum gegum on the right, moleculum gegum, or a Gego molecule, and gegum, as in a Gego thing. In Gego's constructed neologism of the reticularia, the artist's self-fashioning is in the guise of a singular organism, a molecule thing, moving through a vast constellation of languages, territories, and networks of power. If we now consider Gego's first reticularia, if you can now move forward to the reticularia, please. One more. Uno más, por favor. Okay, here we go. Installed, as I said, at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas in '69, we may be struck by its materialization of a condition of double consciousness and exile in all of its creative possibilities and constraints. Following my line of thought today, I'd like to suggest that the territorialization of the subject as an other produces an inscription of otherness in the subject. This is also what W.E.B. Du Bois writes about the color line and what Grada Quilomba is dealing with today in her decolonial practice. So I'd like to suggest, as I said, that the territorialization of the subject as an other produces an inscription of otherness in the subject. The dynamic of integration and difference, visibility and invisibility that I characterized earlier as constitutive for the German Jew. The linguistic, visual, and spatial neologism of the reticularia articulates this precarious subjectivity. It's an interstitial territory where the I survives, if only as a molecule, carving out a space for its own continued deterritorialization. While this condition is liberating in its eccentricity, its drift, or its cosmopolitanism, as many have noted about the reticularia's potential for ongoing expansion, living in suspension is also an exhausting situation that can similarly become an ideology or a strategy for discipline. If the exile cannot be at home or feel at home, she can fabricate many temporary and provisional homes, as well as points of tension to counteract the potential for infinite drift. Next slide, please, and I'm finishing up soon. Gego's knots are a case in point and may be considered as attempts to formulate solutions to question of identity, subjectivity, and autonomy. Quote, "I work by reason of making," she says, or she told José Antonio Pantin in an interview. And accordingly, these little islands are not places of stasis, but places of labor, places of work, places of action. They are instances of decision-making and commitment, places where the artist has actively intervened to iterate a new point of contact. They are also sites in which the artist has made a wager, with each metallic knot opening up a potential scenario for an additional line and another outgrowth, without knowing what the final outcome will be. This is a move away from centralization as an organizing framework towards the margins, yet there's always another knot that can be added, keeping the margin at bay and maintaining a permanent state of interstitiality. Exile, according to Edward Said, means that, quote, "you're always going to be marginal," unquote. If Gego's initial art historical marginality has been largely brought about, if her initial art historical marginality had been largely brought about by the power relations framing the confrontation between European and Latin American modernisms and those who decide what is canonical, what is relevant, and what constitutes the avant-garde, I've tried to attend to something different in this talk. This would be the structural condition of Jewish difference, a form of subjectivization that materialized in a particular historical context of living in a state of double consciousness between Judentum and Deutschtum, and that through the Nazi state of exception turned this double consciousness into a form of life that had to be expelled from the protection of the nation state and left to drift into exile for those who were lucky. This paper has thus begun to map the territory of Gego's exile by examining her neologisms and the reticularia. But there's still much work to be done in crystallizing her articulations of the experience of estrangement and identification through her visual and linguistic idioms. To conclude, and if we could go to the next slide, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, please. This one. To conclude, I think these questions are extremely important to our understanding of Gego's practice, a practice that transformed the interstitial condition of Jewish difference into the center of an aesthetic world without stability and gave rise to an art practice focused on world making, a space for the constitution of subjects, social obligations, and political commitments for those who had lost their world. Thank you very much. And if we can go now to the last slide, please.